Breaking tonight, Australia's energy sovereignty just got compromised. Japan didn't negotiate, they lobbied systematically. Tensions are rising in Canberra tonight. Australia committed to net zero emissions by 2050, but instead of accelerating renewable transition, government ministers held at least 24 secret meetings with Japanese gas companies since Labour came to power in 2022. While Australian citizens assumed their government was planning for a clean energy future, foreign corporations were busy ensuring exactly the opposite. Everyone believed Australia's climate commitments were genuine policy. Environmental groups expected fossil fuel phase-outs within decades. Analysts assumed net zero targets would drive investment decisions. They were all utterly incorrect. Dear viewers, what I'm about to reveal isn't just another lobbying story. This is about how $70 billers in Japanese investment transformed Australian energy policy from climate action into fossil fuel extension. This is about cabinet ministers meeting foreign gas executives while claiming to protect Australia's environmental future. This is about sovereignty surrendered one meeting room at a time. Let me show you exactly what Japan bought with those 24 meetings. InfluenceMap, a leading research think tank tracking corporate influence on climate policy, just released documentation that should terrify every Australian concerned about their country's future. The findings are devastating. Japanese companies including Inpex, Jera, Mitsubishi, and Mitsui hold more than $70 billion in equity across 13 Australian LNG developments. Not million, billion. These 13 developments represent approximately 17% of global LNG capacity. The largest single investment, the Ichthys gas field in the Timor Sea, backed primarily by Inpex. But here's where the numbers become genuinely alarming. Based on projected output, these 13 developments could generate 290 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions annually. That's equivalent to approximately 2/3 of Australia's total annual climate pollution. Let that sink in. Japanese-controlled operations could produce emissions equal to 2/3 of everything Australia currently emits. Translation: while Australian politicians promise net zero by 2050, Japanese corporations are locking in fossil fuel infrastructure that makes those promises mathematically impossible. The meeting rooms where policy was written since 2022, while Australians debated climate policy in public forums, something very different was happening behind closed ministerial doors. Resources Minister Madeleine met with Japanese LNG representatives at least 17 times. 17 separate meetings where foreign gas executives sat across from Australia's energy decision maker. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese himself met with Inpex representatives. 4 other ministers held single meetings with Japanese gas interests. And here's the critical detail that InfluenceMap emphasizes: weak Australian lobbying transparency rules mean these documented 24 meetings likely represent only a fraction of actual interactions. The real number, probably far higher. What were they discussing in those meeting rooms? Freedom of information documents reveal the answer, and it's worse than you think. The policy that Japan bought October 2024, Minister King prepared to visit Japan. Before departure, the Department of Industry, Science and Resources provided her with briefing materials. Those talking points weren't written in Canberra. They were lifted almost verbatim from gas industry language. King was instructed to tell Japanese industry and government leaders that Australia remained firmly committed to remaining a reliable provider of LNG in support of energy security while transitioning to net zero, and welcomed further investment in our gas industry. Notice the carefully constructed contradiction. Transitioning to net zero while welcoming further gas investment, supporting energy security through fossil fuels while promising climate action. This is diplomatic doublespeak perfected. Then came the policy payoff. In 2024, King released Australia's future gas strategy, declaring that new sources of gas would be needed to 2050 and beyond 2050, after both Australian and Japanese governments have committed to reach net zero emissions. The strategy Japan wanted became official Australian policy. Translation: Japanese lobbying didn't just influence Australian energy decisions. It wrote them. The justification that collapsed here's what makes this particularly audacious. Both governments defend this arrangement with identical talking points. Japan needs increased Australian gas supply to cut emissions by replacing coal-fired power and supporting renewable energy transition. Gas as a bridge fuel. Gas as transition energy. Gas is the responsible path to clean energy. Sounds reasonable, right? Except the evidence demolishes this narrative completely. First, Leaked cabinet and confidence advice to the Western Australian government obtained by Guardian Australia challenged this idea directly, warning that unlimited Australian gas exports to Japan and neighboring countries risked slowing the move to cleaner energy in Asia, not accelerating transition, slowing it. Second, a separate report by the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis revealed something that destroys the entire energy security justification. Japanese companies have resold more than one-third of the gas they bought from Australia, reaping more than $1 billions in profit in 2024. Let me repeat that. Japanese multinationals bought Australian gas, supposedly for domestic energy needs, then immediately resold a third of it to other countries for billion-dollar profits. Labor backbencher Ed Husick argued this proved Japanese companies were profiting from Australian resources that weren't actually needed to meet energy demand in Japan. The gas wasn't securing Japanese energy. It was securing Japanese corporate profits. The corporate response when confronted with these findings, Japanese companies didn't deny the resales. They reframed them. In meetings with government officials, Inpex and Jera argued that LNG demand and inventory levels fluctuate in real time and companies maintain a supply buffer to ensure stable energy supply in line with Japanese government policy. Most of what was sold to third countries came from that buffer, they claimed. Translation: we buy more than we need, profit from the surplus, and call it energy security policy. Bill Townsend, senior vice president at Inpex, said the company advocated for stable and predictable policy settings with streamlined development approval processes and reduced red and green tape. Notice the language. Green tape alongside red tape. Environmental regulations treated as bureaucratic obstacles to be eliminated, not safeguards protecting Australia's future. Townsend insisted Inpex was working to support Indo-Pacific energy security while helping the region achieve net zero by 2050. The strategy: carbon capture and storage at the Ichthys development from around 2030. Carbon capture and storage, a technology that, as Townsend himself acknowledged, has not yet been a success at scale. Australia's energy future being bet on unproven technology while proven renewables are sidelined. The scientific consensus they're ignoring, Jack Herring, InfluenceMap's Australia program manager, stated the evidence clearly Japanese LNG investment and lobbying risks locking in fossil fuel dependence across the region, delaying the shift to genuinely clean energy. The claim that gas serves as a transition fuel contradicts evidence published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That same evidence has been endorsed by both Australian and Japanese governments. They cite the science when convenient, ignore it when profitable. Independent MP Monique Ryan noted there was clear scientific consensus that climate pollution needed to be cut, and InfluenceMap's analysis helped explain why the Australian government continues to act as an enabler for Japanese gas companies. It reinforces the need for more transparent regulation of corporate lobbying and for the Australian government to act in the best interests of its citizens rather than those of Japanese companies and their industry associations, Ryan said. Translation: Australia's government is serving Japanese corporate interests instead of Australian national interests. Why this matters beyond gas, dear viewers, this isn't really about LNG. This is about whether Australia functions as a sovereign nation or as a resource extraction zone for foreign corporations. This is about whether democratic governments answer to their citizens or to boardrooms in Tokyo. This is about whether climate commitments mean anything when billions of dollars push in the opposite direction. The pattern InfluenceMap documented is devastating in its simplicity. Japanese companies invest massively in Australian fossil fuel infrastructure. Those companies lobby Australian ministers systematically. Australian policy shifts to protect and extend those investments. Climate commitments become rhetorical decoration while actual policy entrenches fossil fuel dependence. And because Australian lobbying transparency rules remain deliberately weak, citizens cannot even track how many meetings occur, what gets discussed, or which commitments get made behind closed doors. Meanwhile, Japanese companies profit twice. First from Australian gas extraction, then from reselling surplus to third countries. Australian resources financing Japanese corporate growth while Australian climate targets become impossible to achieve. What happens next? A spokesperson for Minister King defended the arrangement, stating Japan had been a strong and valued investment partner for Australia's offshore LNG industry, and the minister met regularly with resources sector stakeholders as part of her role. Notice what's absent from that defense. No mention of climate commitments, no reference to net zero targets. No acknowledgement of the contradiction between policy promises and lobbying outcomes. Just the assertion that meeting with foreign gas interests constitutes normal ministerial business. InfluenceMap's research found Inpex had twice as many meetings with senior government figures as other Japanese gas companies. The company with the largest Australian investment got the most government access. Coincidence? Or the logical outcome of policy capture? Here's the uncomfortable truth this story reveals: Australia's energy transition isn't being determined by climate science, economic analysis, or democratic deliberation. It's being shaped by whoever can afford the most ministerial meeting time. And right now, that's Japanese gas companies with $70 billion worth of reasons to ensure Australian fossil fuel infrastructure operates until 2050 and beyond. This is the moment where Australia decides what kind of country it wants to be. A sovereign nation charting its own energy future based on climate science and national interest, or a resource colony where foreign corporations dictate policy through systematic lobbying while profiting from both extraction and resale. The meetings have already happened. The policy has already been written. The investments have already been made. But transparency can still be demanded. Lobbying rules can still be strengthened. Ministers can still be held accountable for whose interests they actually serve. Dear viewers, between those 24 documented meetings, something fundamental changed in Australia's relationship with its own energy future. Japanese companies didn't just invest in gas infrastructure, they invested in policy influence. And Australian ministers, meeting by meeting, delivered exactly what was purchased. This isn't just about one industry's lobbying success. This is about the fundamental question of whether democratic governments can resist corporate capture when billions of dollars are deployed systematically. The evidence suggests the answer is no, not without transparent lobbying rules, not without public accountability, not without citizens demanding their government serve Australian interests instead of Japanese corporate profits. That's the real story behind those 24 meetings. That's what $70 billion buys in modern democracy. That's why Australia's energy future looks less like climate leadership and more like resource extraction locked in until 2050 and beyond. The question now is what Australians do with this information, because the meetings will continue. The lobbying will intensify, and unless transparency and accountability replace secrecy and access, Australian energy policy will keep getting written in meeting rooms where Japanese executives outnumber Australian citizens. What do you think about Japanese gas companies shaping Australia's energy policy? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more analysis of how corporate lobbying shapes national sovereignty, subscribe and hit the notification bell. This story is far from over.